Good morning, everyone. We'll get started here in just a second. All right. Good morning again, and thank you all for attending the release of the Ohio River Valley Institute's latest report titled Frackalachia Update, Peak Natural Gas and the Economic Implications for Appalachia. We will get started with our program in just a few minutes, but in the meantime, my name is Ben Hunkler. I'm the Communications Manager with the Ohio River Valley Institute, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. If you haven't encountered us before, the Ohio River Valley Institute is a nonpartisan, independent think tank working to advance clean energy, shared prosperity, and more equitable civic structures across Appalachia. If you've been following our work for a while, you may have heard about our previous research demonstrating that the Appalachian shale gas industry failed to deliver on promises of local economic prosperity from the beginning of the fracking boom in 2008 through 2019. Today's report builds on this previous research, analyzing new data and examining the implications of Appalachia's plateauing natural gas production. Sean O'Leary is the author of today's report, and he's a senior researcher with the Ohio River Valley Institute, where he studies energy, petrochemicals, and economic development across Appalachia. We will spend the first half of today's program hearing from Sean about key findings and conclusions from his new research, and then we'll transition into a panel discussion and Q&A. Please feel free to drop questions into the chat or into the Q&A box on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen as they occur to you, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. Joining us today for our panel discussion is Colin Jerelmack, a professor of sociology and environmental studies at New York University, and the author of Up to Heaven and Down to Hell, Fracking, Freedom, and Community in an American Town, which paints a portrait of Greater Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and the broader tension between fracking, freedom, and the tragedy of the commons. Also on our panel today is John Hanger, who operates the energy consulting firm Hanger Consulting, LLC. John served as Secretary of Pennsylvania's Department of Environmental Protection from 2008 to 2011. Colin and John, thanks so much for being here today. Thanks to everyone in the audience. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Sean.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. And if you can pull up the presentation, and Ben, while you're in the process of doing that, it would also be helpful to go ahead and post the presentation so that folks can download it themselves for after today's session. Okay. But again, thank you everyone for coming here today. This is exciting, I will admit, somewhat depressing news that I have to share for the most part, but I do it with the greatest hope because, as those of you who follow the work that we've done know, that at the same time that we're trying to bring fact-based, evidence-based understanding of economic dynamics in the region to policymakers and to the residents of this region, we're also at the same time exploring alternative models for economic development. And before this session is over, we'll talk about some of those that are upcoming. But as Ben said, the first order of business is to do an update, to take a look at where we are with economic development. So Ben, if you could advance to the first slide. The area that we're talking about, that we have named Frackalachia, for lack of a better term, consists of clusters of counties in the greater Ohio River Valley and in northeast Pennsylvania. And as we go through the data, you'll find that for these 22 counties, which produce over 90% of all the natural gas that comes out of Appalachia, we provide breakdowns of key variables, including GDP growth, jobs, income, and population change. Ben, next slide. In the earlier report that we issued in 2021, which contained data through the year 2019, we found a rather remarkable phenomenon going on in Frackalachia. The region was characterized as a result of the natural gas boom, which began in 2008, by a remarkable level of economic growth as measured by GDP. If you look at the chart, you'll see in the left-hand side of the chart bars representing GDP growth for the United States as a whole, for the combined states of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, and then within Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, just those 22 Frackalachia counties that I mentioned a moment ago. And you will see, of course, that GDP growth in the Frackalachia counties was more than triple that of the US economy and more than 4 times that of the combined states of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. And, oftentimes GDP is used as a kind of key indicator of economic prosperity. But one of the peculiar things that happened in Frackalachia is that when you look at measures of local economic prosperity, such as income, jobs, and population, while GDP had skyrocketed, the measure of personal income actually lagged that of the nation and even of the 3 states. When you look at jobs, there had been almost no job movement whatsoever, again, despite that huge run-up in GDP. And of course, population was at that time in absolute decline. And so what most people imagine to be the usual linkage between GDP growth and measures of local prosperity had clearly been severed in this particular case. And Ben, if you can go to the next slide. Because of that severing of GDP and measures of prosperity, Frackalachia's shares of the US economy diverged in wildly different directions. The share of GDP that Frackalachia was contributing to the national economy increased by more than 1/3, but the share of American jobs, of personal income, and of population all went into decline. Ben, could you go to the next slide? Now, since that report, a few things changed, and some fairly significant things. The first is, of course, that we experienced the COVID epidemic in 2020, the presidential election in 2020, and then also with that, directional changes both in federal policy regarding energy transition, and also, I should add, that markets have changed considerably. And that's a subject that John Hanger will be able to talk about in a little more detail a little later. But I do want to emphasize that although we did go through the presidential election, and there clearly have been policy changes, the period that we're looking at in this report, which goes through 2021, predates both the full enactment of the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act. So it does not include any of the impacts associated with those 2 pieces of legislation. Ben, if you could advance. And to the next slide. And so when we look at the situation in which Frackalachia finds itself now as compared to 2 years ago when we did the original report, a couple of significant things have happened. The first is that you'll notice over on the left side, the blue columns, you'll notice that in 2019, Frackalachia's GDP growth exceeded that of the nation by 35%. However, since about 2019, Frackalachia's growth and the growth of the natural gas industry has begun to plateau. And as a result of that, and meanwhile, the nation's economy as a whole has continued to grow, so that as a result, between 2021, when we did our last report, and this report, which goes through 2021, Frackalachia has started to give back some of its advantage. So now the GDP growth only exceeds that of the nation by 25%. But at the same time, the measures of jobs, income, and population have all worsened. The decline in the share of jobs has gone from 7.6% to 8%. Income has dropped to 10% below the national average, and population is almost smaller by 13%. Next slide, Ben. And if we drill down on just the variables of jobs and population, and we look at it at the state level, you see that, for instance, in the chart in the upper left, that in the state of Ohio, overall in that period of 2008 to 2021, the number of jobs increased by a little over 4%. However, in the Frackalachia Ohio counties, they declined by almost 8%. Pennsylvania did a little better. It had about the same amount of job growth statewide as Ohio did, and it actually eked out a really tiny growth in jobs in the Frackalachia counties, but it still trailed the state considerably. I'd also add, in the case of Pennsylvania, Washington County, which is the largest in population of the Frackalachia counties, is the sole reason that it eked out that small gain in jobs. The remaining Pennsylvania Frackalachia counties were also in negative territory. And then finally, in West Virginia, you see, West Virginia's economy faces a number of challenges. And so this is the one instance in which the Frackalachia counties outperformed the state of West Virginia for jobs, although even that was in negative territory. And then if you go to the lower right, you'll see the changes in population are frankly even more distressing. You can see the 7% decline in population in the Frackalachia counties in Ohio, 3% in Pennsylvania, and 8% in West Virginia. Next slide, Ben. And this slide is somewhat an act of personal privilege on my part. As many of you know, I'm from Wheeling, Warwood specifically, which is a Frackalachia county that sits along the Ohio River, along with 3 counties in Ohio, Jefferson, Belmont, and Monroe, and 3 other counties in West Virginia. And I highlight these because if you have to pick a ground zero for Frackalachia, this is it. And as you can see, the Ohio River Frackalachia counties are doing markedly worse than Frackalachia as a whole. And frankly, again, if you're in the area, you can, if you drive through the downtowns of Steubenville, Wheeling, Martins Ferry, Shadyside, and you compare those to places like even other Frackalachia counties like Waynesburg in Pennsylvania, or surrounding areas, you can see the difference and how much worse conditions are in those Ohio River counties. Ben, if you could go to the next slide. And so let's go back and kind of examine those 4 variables that we've talked about: GDP, jobs, income, and population. This is a map or a chart of GDP showing in the red line the growth of GDP in Frackalachia since 2008. And you see that huge run-up associated with the boom that began leveling off actually as early as 2015 and has stayed fairly constant. Meanwhile, both the national and the combined state GDPs, while still greatly trailing Frackalachia, are beginning to close the gap. Next slide. If you read the report, you will find a complete breakdown by individual counties. And you'll see that some of the numbers are absolutely eye-popping. 19 of the 22 Frackalachia counties exceeded the nation for GDP growth over that period of time, and half of the Frackalachia counties had growth rates that were at least 3 times that of the US economy, which is remarkable output. And you can see triple-digit growth in many Frackalachia counties. Next slide. When we look at jobs, we see the same dynamic taking place, except that by about the year 2014, an initial burst in jobs in Frackalachia began to give way to decline, so that by the middle of the last decade, Frackalachia was actually falling behind the state and the nation for job growth, and then by 2019 had entered negative territory. And even in the year after COVID shut down much of the economy, you'll notice that the bounce back, the angle of the line between 2020 and 2021 in Frackalachia is not as steep as that as the nation and the states. The point being that Frackalachia is in the process of falling even farther behind. But the net is that in all, Frackalachia between 2008 and 2021, far from adding jobs as a result of the natural gas boom, actually lost more than 10,000 of them. Next slide. And as we pointed out before, the job loss is especially bad in the Ohio Valley. If you go down to the bottom of the list, Jefferson, Tyler, Wetzel, those and Monroe are all Ohio River Valley communities that have over 10% job loss in them. Next slide. Population is remarkably dropping even faster than jobs. Again, this is where you see perhaps the greatest divergence of Frackalachia as compared to the nation and to the combined states of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. But in all, Frackalachia has lost more than 47,000 residents during this period of time. It's lost a city the size of Charleston, West Virginia, basically, which for me as a native West Virginian is a somewhat sobering way to think about this. Next slide. And as you can see, the rates of population loss, basically with the exception of Washington, Pennsylvania, every Frackalachia county lost population. Some of the population loss levels are remarkable. And again, you see them heavily concentrated in the Ohio Valley region. Next slide, Ben. And finally, with income growth, we see that Frackalachia, this is the one area where for a long time, Frackalachia more or less kept up at least with the states of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. But in the last 2 years, it has even started to fall behind the combined states in income growth as well. Next slide, Ben. But there is a real mix. You see some states, some Frackalachia counties do better than the states, some do worse, but most continue to do worse than the nation as a whole. Next slide. And the one after that, please. Maybe the most sobering thing about all this is that while all that the numbers I've shown you so far indicate is that the trends that we had seen previously are continuing. But there are still many policymakers and many people in the region who hold out hope that natural gas development and downstream industries from natural gas, such as petrochemicals, will eventually become an economic savior. The problem is that faith is being undermined not just by the past experience that I've reviewed over the last few minutes, but it's now being undermined by the fact that the gas industry is plateauing in Appalachia. On the chart at the left, you see the Energy Information Administration's forecast of natural gas production from now through the year 2050. And I must say, although currently natural gas production actually is way up in the region, as is oil production, over time it is expected that in Frackalachia, natural gas production is initially going to decline and then perhaps only grow very, very gradually between now and the middle of the century. And that finding is consistent, I might add, with the International Energy Administration's analysis of what will happen with global production. And, we can talk about the reasons for this. I know, again, John Hanger is quite expert in some of the factors that are contributing to this. But the other indicator that Appalachian natural gas production is going to flatten out is that, frankly, it already has. If you look at the chart at the right, you'll see that Appalachia, which is represented by the blue line, went through that huge increase in production between 2008 and about 2019. And then it began to flatten out. Meanwhile, the combined regions of the Permian and Haynesville down around the Gulf Coast and the Southwest have picked up and have now, in combination, have actually surpassed Appalachia. Now, because the Haynesville and the Permian are considered two different basins, Appalachia continues to carry the mantle as the largest gas producing region in the nation. But as you can see, those two regions are the only two regions in the nation in which production is still growing at a significant rate. And so we're faced with this question of, when we think about economic development in the region, whether it is sensible for policymakers to continue to rely on or see natural gas development as an important building block of energy prosperity when it was not able to deliver prosperity during the time when it was vibrant and growing. So what are the chances that it's likely to do so as it reaches the stasis of middle age and stagnates? And, the answer to that question, I think, pretty self-evidently is the chances are not great. Next slide. And that's a problem because, frankly, one of the great challenges we face as a region is that so much attention, and when I say attention, I don't only mean attention in our minds and in our discourse about economic development, has been concentrated on the energy industries generally and natural gas in particular, but so has much of the money. When we think about tax policy and economic development policy, and to the point that oftentimes policymakers don't even think beyond the gas and petrochemical industries. The visual that you see is the cover of an economic development strategy from an organization called Belomar, which is the economic development organization that serves the combined counties of Belmont County, Ohio, Ohio County, West Virginia, Marshall, and Wetzel counties as well. These are the regions that, as we saw earlier, are among the most deeply afflicted. And when they did their SWOT analysis of economic development opportunities in 2022, sadly, when you look at the upper right-hand corner at opportunities, the only opportunities that they could identify were the proposed PTT cracker plant in Belmont County, Ohio, and downstream industries that might result from that cracker plant. Now, as many of you know, that project is moribund and almost certainly not likely ever to be developed, which is a rather distressing thing when you consider that that seems to be the only economic development idea that is present at this point for the people who are trying to make a difference in that region. And for me, that bespeaks the need for new exploration, new examinations, new strategies for economic development. Next slide, Ben. And so Orvi is trying to help the region rethink these issues, reimagine what is possible and how to get there. And so there are actually 3 items that I want to mention and recommend to those of you who do care about these issues and do care about economic development. One of those is on the left, the Centralia model for economic transition in distressed communities. It's a 2021 report that Orvi put out looking at an old coal community that has experienced significant economic growth, job growth, and income growth, despite losing its coal mine and a coal-fired power plant. It offers a replicable model that I hope many policymakers in the region will look at. The second is a clean energy pathway for southwestern Pennsylvania by the analytics firm Stratagen, which examined the question of how, in an age of decarbonization, can the energy system in our region be changed to embrace renewable resources to replace fossil fuel resources, and can it do it in a way that is both sound from an energy cost perspective, from a reliability perspective, but also importantly from an economic development perspective. It's a remarkable publication. I hope you'll check it out. And finally, I wanted to mention that in association with the Centralia model, in about 3 weeks, the folks at the Ohio State University Department of Agricultural, Environmental, and Development Economics will come out with a full quantitative assessment of the Centralia experience, which demonstrates the ability of the measures that were taken there, not just to trigger growth in jobs and prosperity, but to do it in a way that is actually replicable in our region. So again, thank you for coming today. Thank you for paying attention to these reports. And Ben, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Sean. I will add links to both of those reports as well as to Sean's slideshow in the chat in just a moment. We're now going to transition over to the Q&A portion of today's program. And again, I would encourage you to add any questions you might have for Sean or for our panelists into the chat or the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But my first question is for John Hanger. So John, as Sean explained, so far this year, we are seeing record levels of gas production. But why do the Energy Information Administration and the International Energy Agency see natural gas peaking, especially in Appalachia?
Well, they see it peaking because it already has peaked. They're reporting a fact. It's peaked. The golden age of gas is over. The IEA probably did more to popularize that phrase, golden age of gas, than any other single outlet. And they did it around 2010. So you can consider the last 15 years, starting in 2008, to be the golden age of gas. But it's over. And as Sean put it, the industry now is not growing really. Indeed, the IEA says that global gas demand fell by 1.2% in 2022. That's a very unusual thing to have happen for a fossil fuel demand in the course of a non-recessionary year to fall. It says it will be flat again in 2023. Just to wrap this up a little bit, 2022 was a pivot year. The world largely drew the conclusion, based on the pricing in the natural gas markets around the world, including LNG, that gas is too risky for their economies, and because of the Russian invasion, it's too risky for their national security. So in 2022, the world writ large, Europe, Japan, China, many, many parts of the world, really an emergency basis, started to deploy renewable energy and other non-fossil fuel alternatives, including electrification for buildings, to wean itself off natural gas. And we're already seeing now the results of that, which is a plateau. And I suspect it's going to surprise people, but I think we'll see some real declines over the next 15 years.
Thank you, John. Colin, this question is for you. So as Sean explained, job growth is stagnant or negative in most of Frackalachia, but the loss of population may be an even bigger problem. Can you talk a little bit about the choices people are faced with amid the shale gas boom?
Sure, and I'll just preface this real quickly by saying that where I draw the authority from which I speak on this is a year I spent living in Lycoming County, Pennsylvania, talking to people who were making a decision on whether or not to lease their land for natural gas drilling, people who were pushing back against natural gas, people who supported and got jobs in the industry. And then I've spent the past 6 or 7 years following up with this particular community. And so it's to say that I did spend a lot of time, this question about choices people are faced with, a lot of what I'm about to say is based on particular experiences I had with these folks. So one phenomenon that I'm sure a lot of people here have heard and are familiar with that is an important context for this is so-called brain drain. There's been an exodus of people from so-called heartland communities. There's fewer local jobs and opportunities altogether, but even more so, there's a bigger crunch for college-educated young adults. And so in this sense, there's this push factor as a lot of people who want to go to college and want to get a job that, you know, is a professional white-collar job feel pushed out of these regions, right? They call these push factors. I should also add that there's more people leaving, not attending the regional colleges that are nearby them. And so a lot of people are leaving home for college and they're not coming back. And so that's a context in which, you know, people making a decision on if they're going to stay or if they're going to go. A lot of these jobs that were there during the fracking boom allowed some people to make the decision to stay. But even then, a lot of those jobs were not jobs that people who had a college degree wanted or saw as an opportunity for continued career advancement. Another major group is, you know, a lot of people, which was surprising to me as a New Yorker, even people who are working class or would be considered to be living in poverty own land in this area, right? They might be land poor. They're 5th or 6th generation landowners who are holding on to ancestral farmland. But these days, almost none of them can make a living as full-time farmers. And every year when the tax bill rolls around, that's seen as a millstone where some people would face the issue of, am I going to be the generation that loses the ancestral estate? And so fracking offered a hope of reversing Rust Belt decline. That, you know, an opportunity for a number of blue-collar jobs, whether as a truck driver, a welder, a roughneck. In the area where I was living and writing about, Halliburton and opened a facility in Muncie, which at its peak employed 600 workers. Individuals can lease their land for oil and gas drilling, gas in this region, and can make money, royalties. And so just to give you one, for instance, I came to know a landowner named George Hagemeyer who was living on a modest pension from being a retired custodian. He leased his land, 6 natural gas wells were drilled on it, and his first royalty check for 1 month of production was $34,000. And so people making this decision on, am I going to lease my land for oil and gas drilling? It provided a hope and a real opportunity that they might be able to hold on to their land and maybe even make some money and catapult themselves into the middle class. So a lot of people knew that they might be risking their idyllic rural environment or air and water quality, but there was this promise made by landmen, the people who would sign you to a lease, and the petroleum companies, of decades of prosperity, right? People would often say, well, these gas wells will produce for 30 or 40 years. All these jobs, these blue-collar jobs, will be here for decades. And so this was considered a bet that was worth taking for a lot of people. I should note as well that America is one of the only countries in the world where the majority of landowners own the subsurface. which means that fracking, the decision of whether or not to frack, is actually a bunch of landowners individually deciding whether or not to lease their own land for gas drilling. So the other issue as far as the decisions people faced is a number of people thought, well, even if I'm not sure I want to lease my land, if everybody around me leases their land, I'm still going to deal with the spillover effects of that, and I'm not going to make any money. So people also, were compelled in some ways, pushed to lease their land. It's a resource dilemma. They understood that even me not leasing my land, I might not stop the negative effects if everybody around me drills. As this report by Orvie and its prior ones points out so well, the bust came pretty quickly. That Halliburton facility in Muncie went from 600 workers to a skeleton crew of 40 in a matter of years. It even dragged down a lot of local businesses that existed prior to drilling. So for instance, New Weld in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, which Ted Cruz stopped at his 2016 presidential campaign and pointed out all the jobs that New Weld got through drilling, and that this was the beginning of a manufacturing renaissance. New Weld declared bankruptcy soon after and was actually dragged under by oil and gas drilling. I met George's royalty check. His first month with $34,000. By the end of the year, his check was $600 for a month. So that's still free, in a way, money he wasn't getting before. But the idea that he was going to be able to make a bunch of money over a sustained period of time to really change his financial situation for the long term, went away. And so in that regard, these are the decisions people face. They're the population decision on, if I stay, are there job opportunities for me here, especially job opportunities for college educated people? And then on the individual level, landowners, do I lease my land for drilling or not? And deal with some of the externalities that might come, but perhaps have this chance for economic liberty. So I think I'm done there. Thanks.
Thanks a ton for that context, Colin. And John, back to you. So given this depopulation and the economic decline we're seeing in Frackalachia, why do most elected representatives from these counties continue to aggressively support the industry?
Well, it's a great question. It's a little loaded, at least when handed to me. Look, American politics, unfortunately, is inundated, one could say, drowning in big money. We can see it from the Supreme Court, recent reporting, even at the Supreme Court, all the way down to a state representative in Pennsylvania. And those with the major investments in the economy, tend to invest heavily in politics. And often those investments in politics are the best investments they make. They have a very high return on investment, much higher than they get by investing in, say, oil and gas drilling directly. So I don't think you can answer that question honestly without at least laying on the table money in politics. The second thing I would say is they need an alternative, and the people in these communities need an alternative. If not drilling, what? And that's the challenge that Sean and Orvie is taking on. You have to provide an alternative. Somebody who is drowning, and in many cases these counties continue to lose population and have declining jobs, perhaps even declining income. At least comparatively, they're losing ground in income. They are understandably grasping at whatever alternatives come their way. So that this is a very, very compelling human problem fundamentally. This is about people's ability to stay on the land, as Colin pointed out. It's about their ability to very frankly, stay out of poverty. And it's also about people's hopes and dreams for their children and grandchildren. And unless there's an alternative, and I think there are alternatives, and the Centralia model that Orvie has written about is one, but education, healthcare are others. that have worked in Pennsylvania. There's a reason why Allegheny County is doing really well. It's got a lot, it's not oil and gas drilling, it's not really energy. It's because of tremendous investments in education and healthcare and some of the tech industry. So there are alternatives, but we're at a point now where oil and gas is a distraction, I think, and it prevents focus on what could in fact be a real alternative way of growing population, stabilizing income, perhaps even growing income, and creating more jobs.
Thank you, John. So Colin, this human problem that John describes in relation to the fracking industry, the health impacts, the environmental impacts, and the economic conditions that we've seen that have resulted from natural gas development. Could you talk a little bit to why we don't see more residents of this region, the general population, in open opposition to the gas industry?
Sure. This is changing a little bit. So Pennsylvania a few years ago finally tipped, for instance, toward a majority of Pennsylvania residents supporting a ban on fracking, and that was considered to be major, that for the first time, more than 50%. However, not surprisingly, if you break down where those 50% or 51% are coming from, they're almost entirely coming from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, right? So we know from great survey research by people like Federal Adoption that the closer one lives to an oil and gas well, the less likely they are to support regulations on it. And so it's interesting that we don't really have so much. Obviously, there's exceptions, but we don't. Anti-fracking isn't really a not in my backyard movement. It's more of a not in your backyard movement. It's largely propelled by people living in areas where shale drilling is not occurring, not entirely, but largely in urban and coastal areas. And so I think one answer to that, which is pretty obvious, is at least the perception of economic benefits, right? When I talk to people on the ground, Williamsport saw things happen. They saw new hotels being built. They saw gravel roads being paved. They saw contributions from the oil and gas companies leading to improvements of the Little League World Series baseball compound, right? They could point to things and say, look at this, right? Now, of course, those hotels are struggling with vacancy issues and the like, but it's to say that this perception of economic benefit and then individuals getting royalty checks, there's one answer for you, right? But I think what's more compelling and interesting to that, and I'm cognizant of time, so I'll just tell this quickly through a story. I wrote about a couple, Tom and Mary Crawley, who wound up with contaminated drinking water due to a gas well drilled on their neighbor's property. And the interesting thing happened was that they refused to talk to the media or go public with their story, despite the fact that the company denied responsibility. The DEP, in their view, wasn't really doing enough to remedy the situation. They were struggling to afford a lawyer, and there was an environmental group that was offering them a free lawyer, but they still wouldn't talk about what had happened to them. And it took them a year for them to talk to me. And when I talked to them finally, they were not making any money off this industry personally. And now they were on the receiving end of contamination, but they still said that they supported fracking, and they didn't want to come out and become like the poster child of being of the anti-fracking movement, because from their view, it was two things. One, partisan identity is really important and can sometimes even be more important than like rational decisions based on economics. A lot of people in the area that I wrote about and in the broader region of Frackalachia are lean conservative and even libertarian. And so in general, they don't support state and federal regulations. In general, they don't support environmental regulations. So even in this instance of contamination, the Crawleys weren't happy about it. But what they wanted to do was sue the company. Their answer was like an individual level, I sue this company, but that doesn't mean I support greater regulation of this industry. They're skeptical in general of state and federal level regulation. They were worried that it would infringe on property rights and people's ability to do what they wanted with their own property. So there's this kind of like partisan commitment to being against environmental regulation. The other thing I saw happening was that people who came in visibly and were protesting and were against fracking, a number of them were from urban places. There was a tour bus from New York that came through with Sean Lennon, Yoko Ono, and other celebrities, protested against fracking. And very much this cemented in a lot of people's view that to be against fracking was to be an urban liberal who didn't really understand and wasn't connected to the local community. And it also meant that actually the Crawleys were really worried that if they went public, that protesters would show up literally in protests, like camp out and protest at their neighbor's house. And so in their view, to be a skeptical and to be against fracking was to be like in league with urban liberals, and to sort of standing to remain in support of a fracking despite what had happened to them, despite that they never made any money and can't drink their water, was seen as being in solidarity with the community. They could still point to other people who did benefit economically from it, and they were skeptical more broadly of environmental regulation. And so I think those are some of the reasons we can point to.
Great. Thanks so much, Colin. So we are now going to transition over to some audience questions. And the first comes from John Hurdle, who asks about this question of alternative development. Sean, I'll pose this one to you. Why is the Centralia model relevant to Appalachia?
Well, Centralia, I should emphasize, I'm talking about Centralia, Washington, not Centralia, Pennsylvania, which has its own noteworthy story. Centralia, Washington is, although it's in the Pacific Northwest, an old coal town. Its largest employer for decades was a coal mine, and its second largest employer was a coal-fired power plant. And going back to the mid-1990s, the economy of Centralia, Washington tracked very closely the economies in the Ohio River Valley. They were, in fact, statistically almost indistinguishable when you look at the kind of measures that we've been talking about today. Then in the year 2016, it was the coal mine had closed, and it was announced that the power plant would close down. And in conjunction with that, they implemented a transition plan with $55 million in economic transition funding. From the start of that plan in 2016, those statistical lines for Centralia and the Ohio Valley, which had gone in parallel for 2 decades, suddenly diverged. The Ohio Valley counties continued their decline, but Centralia took off in jobs and income growth and population growth as well. And as we'll see in a report that's soon to come out from Ohio State University, the principal cause of that was the transition that was characterized by significant investments in clean energy transition. So even as the coal economy was in collapse in Centralia, the number of jobs and economic prosperity actually grew.
Thanks, Sean. Our next pair of questions comes from Kathy Ann Kowalski, who asks about a few data questions. So she's wondering if the data that we've seen in the report addresses the impacts of recovery from nationwide and statewide recessions. And she also asks about the response to industry spokespeople who might claim that the oil and gas industry, has cushioned losses that would otherwise have been occurring due to losses in manufacturing jobs and coal jobs. Sean, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, we've actually, Kathy, looked at that question in particular, and we've done it in 2 ways. First of all, with respect to the question about the recession and how that, may have affected the numbers and recovery, the reason that we compare the experience in Frackalachia to the experience of the nation as a whole and to the combined 3 states of Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania is because they also went through those same recessions. And so it gives us a benchmark against which we can see whether or the degree to which Frackalachia may have done better or worse as a result of that. And in fact, Frackalachia did generally weather the 2008 recession comparatively well. It too lost jobs, but it did reasonably well. But as we saw by the middle of the last decade, that had any advantage had pretty much evaporated. With respect to the cushioning question and whether the natural gas industry may have offset other factors that may have caused the economies in these counties to collapse, there are two things that we did to try to assess that, and we determined that no, it's not that these economies are being dragged down by other factors. The first thing that we did was look at the character of unemployment rates in Ohio, and specifically in Belmont County, which is the largest gas-producing county. And what we saw was that while unemployment rates in the county between 2008 and 2020 did come down, it didn't come down because Belmont County was adding jobs. It came down because Belmont County was losing population and losing workforce even faster than it was losing jobs. And so it was a case of addition by subtraction. It wasn't that you were adding more jobs, it's that you were shrinking your workforce and hence shrinking the denominator for the unemployment rate calculation. And of course, population loss means talent pool loss. It is a badly degrading effect on the economy as a whole. In fact, you're almost better off having a rising unemployment rate than a declining unemployment rate when it's only being achieved because you're depleting your talent pool. The second way in which we addressed that question of, well, gee, could this be because other sectors of the economy are offsetting those gains, was we did a report last year called Misplaced Faith, in which we compared the experiences of rural counties in Pennsylvania. There are 30 of them, 10 of which were pretty deeply involved in the natural gas boom, 20 of which were not. And so if it were the case that the gas industry was offsetting declines in other industries, you would have expected to see that in the non-natural gas counties, that they would have done even worse than the natural gas counties did. In fact, the opposite is the case. The natural gas counties did as badly or worse than the non-natural gas counties for jobs and population, suggesting again, and even when we looked at the non-natural gas economy at the other components of GDP, we saw almost no change in those components. So the answer is no, this is not a case in which the natural gas industry is doing its job, but merely offsetting declines in other areas of the economy. That, I'm afraid, is not the case.
I would like to quickly add that these energy industries compete with each other. And gas has been a ferocious competitor with coal. And very frankly, there's been huge job loss in coal for a variety of reasons, but one of which is very, very low price gas. So there's been some cannibalization going on within fossil fuels, and that's probably particularly intense in Pennsylvania.
And specifically in the Frackalachia counties, John, in Greene County, Pennsylvania, in particular.
Exactly. Yeah. So when you see net increase in gas jobs, if you do see such a thing, you have to look at what happened to coal. I'll also say 3 Mile Island Nuclear Station probably closed first and foremost because of low price electricity, which is driven by natural gas. Those are very, very good paying jobs in Dauphin County, Pennsylvania. That probably can be the loss of which were, again, not for any one reason, but if I were going to pick the single biggest reason, it was the low price of wholesale gas in PJM. That was largely driven by low price natural gas. So it's just not the case that this industry has cushioned anywhere. In some cases, it's directly caused job loss.
Thank you both. I've added a link to Orvy's misplaced faith report to the chat here. So if you'd like to take a look at that, please do so. We're coming up towards the end of our program and likely only have time for about one more question. But please continue to add your questions to the chat or the Q&A. We will save the chat and we'll try to address any questions or comments that y'all might have via email following today's program. But turning back to the question of alternative development, could we talk a little bit about the impact of the IIJA and the IRA, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and their how they might affect economic development in the Ohio River Valley region moving forward?
Oh, this is a very mixed bag of what's going on because, as you're aware, particularly the Inflation Reduction Act contains a menu, a very broad menu of incentives for activities ranging from hydrogen to coal and natural gas mitigation to energy efficiency. And so in some respects, in many respects, we're seeing some real benefits in Appalachia from this. I mean, my favorite example is the Form Energy iron air battery plant that is now under construction in Weirton, West Virginia, right on the Ohio River in that afflicted area that I was telling you about before, which will create 750 jobs. And it will be a plant that produces utility scale batteries with 100-hour endurance, which will be used, frankly, to help integrate renewable resources into the grid. And then we know that there are a number of other battery factories and other things that are going up in the area, not as many perhaps as in Kentucky and Tennessee, but nonetheless, we're beginning to see the benefits, at least in West Virginia, certainly, somewhat in Ohio, not as much in Pennsylvania yet, but hopefully that will come. At the same time, there are some distressing elements of the IRA, particularly it's the amount of support that it's offering for carbon capture and sequestration, which may have the effect of perpetuating the life of coal and gas-fired power plants in some cases, which is an economically absurd thing to do because it's a ridiculously expensive technology. But again, because incentives exist out there, we may find some economically irrational choices being made. And so one of the issues Orvy is working on is to try to assess the threat that that poses and bring it to policymakers' attention. Oh, Ben, could I throw in one other thing? Please. The other element that I'd like to throw in is that there is a considerable amount of money available under the IRA for energy efficiency. And frankly, we're at risk because of the focus on energy production in Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania, in the state legislatures and the administrations. We are not, as a region, doing a very good job of accessing or trying to access the funds that are available for energy efficiency. And they have the twin benefit of both helping us decarbonize, but as the Centralia example points out, they are also powerful engines of economic development. And one of the wishes that I have is that policymakers in all three states will become at least as aggressive in pursuing energy efficiency funds that are available through the IRA as they have been in pursuing hydrogen funds and carbon capture funds.
Thanks, Sean. And that'll bring us to the top of the hour. So thank you all so much for joining us today for the release of our new report. Thank you to Colin and John for attending our panel and for your insight here. Again, we hope to address all of the questions that were posed in the Q&A in the chat. We will follow up with an email either later today or tomorrow with a recording of today's session and a link to the new report. But again, we'd just like to thank you for being here today and hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Take care.